Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Residence Palace International Press Center. My name is Isabelle Hoberg. I'm the director of the International Press Center. Welcome to the fourth Residence Palace Talks for Journalists, today on the theme of climate change and migration. Before entering into the issue, just some words for the journalists who didn't attend the previous sessions of the Residence Palace Talks for Journalists. The Talks for Journalists are an initiative of the Residence Palace in co-creation with Belgian, European and International Journalists Association and Federation, the Regional Information Center for Western Europe of the United Nations, and the Belgian Federal Institute for Sustainable Development in co-creation with journalists. The Talks for Journalists are roundtable discussions for you, journalists and news editors, in the context of climate emergency and the overstepping of several planetary boundaries. Our intention is to give you more tools to deal with misinformation and greenwashing, as well as with the sometimes highly technical issues linked to the climate crisis, which affect, as you know, all spheres of our society: finance, economy, industry, agriculture, mobility, education, employment, energy, culture, etc., etc. These meetings are created for you and dedicated to you. If you would like certain topics to be discussed or organized with a particular speaker, please let us know. There is a sheet of paper at the entrance to write your suggestions. We wanted to give this exchange an intimate character, a conversation between you and experts. So this expert's introduction will be recorded, but not the discussions that follow. We will leave a maximum of 10 to 15 minutes to the speakers as an introduction, and then leave the floor open for discussions. Please feel free to add the speaker's presentation with feedback from your own experience, something you have encountered in your media, for example. Today we will finish the talk at 10:30. The contact details of the speakers will appear on that screen at that moment, so that you can contact them if you would need to afterwards. Don't forget the breakfast at the back of this room. Between the partners, we have planned a rotating system of governance, which each partner taking in charge the organizing of the meeting in turn. Today's meeting has been organized by the International Press Association. I will now give the floor to Hans de Bruin from the International Press Association. I wish you a rewarding morning.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Hans de Bruin. I'm Secretary General of, we call it API, the Association de la Presse Internationale, here in Brussels. I will keep it short because we have to start the meeting. This meeting is about climate change and migration. We tend to talk about climate change affecting us here in Europe, but the effects of climate change on other parts of the world are even greater than what we suffer here. Climate change causes extreme weather conditions, drought and rising sea levels, forcing millions of people to leave their homes and lose their homes. This leads to migration flows, often to areas that are already overpopulated or economically vulnerable. Without international cooperation and sustainable solutions, social tensions, conflicts, and humanitarian crises arise. To discuss these problems and challenges, we have two eminent experts here. Let me shortly introduce them before we go to their presentation and discussion. Dr. Susanne Melde, in the middle here, is the Global Thematic Specialist on Climate Action at the International Organization for Migration in its office here in Brussels. She has a track record of coordinating cutting-edge, sorry, I'm reading the bio you sent me, coordinating cutting-edge research on migration as an adaptation strategy around the world, trained and supported many governments and focused on the topic since 2007. Dr. Heather Grabbe, the other side, is a senior fellow at the Bruegel Institute, the economics think tank here in Brussels, as well as a visiting professor at the University College in London. She focuses on the political economy of the European Green Deal and how climate transition will change the EU's international relationships and external policies. She was also director of the Open Society European Policy Institute here in Brussels, and earlier deputy director of the Center for European Reform in London. I will now start giving the word to Susanne first. I believe that was the deal. Okay. And as Isabel already told, she will talk for 10 to 15 minutes maximum, and then it's your turn. And
sure. Hi, everyone. I'm going to stand up so can actually see a bit the presentation. Maybe a few words on IOM, the International Migration. Was established in 1951. We're an intergovernmental organization, and since 2016, we're part of the UN system. So we're the UN Migration Agency. We have 175 member states and a global footprint, so offices in almost all countries around the world. And we work on different operational aspects, such as humanitarian support, but also in migration governance and on research data and policy. And maybe to also say we have a global office here in Brussels where we do liaison with EU institutions, bodies and agencies. So why do we talk about this topic? In 2023, there were more new internal displacements due to disasters than due to conflict. So just to give you an idea that this is really a topic where we also see a lot of movement. What I will do, I will speak a bit about the definitions we understand as climate migration or climate mobility, and then look at the existing data, so you can also see a bit, I think it's disconnecting, and then look at some of the solutions and approaches we're taking at IOM. So how do we define environmental migration? So our Council of Member States in 2007 recognized this as an important topic. Maybe I need to stand in the direction of the antenna and accept a working definition. Otherwise, yeah, should I just take the mic? I'll take this one. Okay, this is probably better. So what we look at is, environmental migrants are persons or groups of persons who, for predominant reasons, link to sudden or progressive changes in the environment. So there you see it can be what we call fast onset, so like a disaster, like a flood, or slow processes, as Hans mentioned, sea level rise, desertification, etc., that adversely affect their lives or living conditions and are obliged to leave their habitual homes or choose to do so. So there you have the two criteria of it can be forced. So if there's a disaster, people need to be evacuated, so you have to leave, or people choose like migration as an adaptation strategy, go somewhere else, for seasonal work. And then either temporarily or permanently. So again, if we take the example of a storm or floods, if people are evacuated, that's usually for a short amount of time, or people move away to other areas, and who either move within countries or across international borders. And I'll come to how significant these movements are. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that in the decision to migrate, and I'll explain this, there's a lot of text and a lot of different factors. The decision to migrate is usually based on a number of factors. So you have factors at the macro level, that includes environmental impacts, but also, social norms such as gender norms, demographic aspects, aging societies or youth, very young societies, political factors. And then there's, at the meso level, again, Do people have the networks? Do they have the links? Can they go somewhere? Do they have the information? And of course, also personal characteristics. Often in households, it's the men, young men who are sent somewhere else. So what does that mean? To give you an example, you may recall the Hurricane Katrina in the US in 2005 in New Orleans. And what really made the news were all these people that were evacuated into the Superdome, this American football stadium. So there was one event and it had very different outcomes for different people. So some, like those who were wage earners who had, to earn their income every week, they had to be evacuated. Maybe they lived in very vulnerable areas to flooding. And others took their family, packed up their things into their car, took the most important things, and were able to stay with friends or relatives. So they had the networks to have, take a different decision than those who were evacuated. So just to keep in mind that the same event can have very different outcomes for different groups of people based on different factors. And what's also important to keep in mind that not everyone who wants to move actually can move. So we call that immobility. There's two groups there. One we call trapped populations, so people who are maybe affected by river flooding twice a year and would like to move out but don't have the money because you need to buy a ticket to take the bus to the next big city. And then there's groups of people who may not want to move out, even though the area is always affected by weather-related disasters. That could be, we did some research in Vietnam because they don't want to leave their land behind or their house behind, or they have social obligations to care for the elderly. So just to keep in mind, it's complex, and these decisions are not just based on one factor. And maybe many of you are migrants as well, so you can also recall that maybe coming here was also based on a number of factors, and it's the same for climate migration. So what's the data that we have? We only have reliable data on internal displacement within countries. That in general is the biggest movement, also in general on migration. Most movements take place within countries or regions. To move far away is usually not the most common movement. What you see on this map is, in blue you see new internal displacement due to disasters in 2023, and in orange due to conflict. What you can see there, internal displacement happens everywhere, in blue due to disasters. And what's also interesting, as I mentioned at the beginning, actually, if you look at the entire year, I won't get into the details of how this data works, but basically in the 12 months in 2023, these were new displacements. That's not necessarily people, because you can be displaced several times by the, subsequent hurricanes or several floods. And so just to give you the figures, in 2023, 26.4 million people were displaced by disasters, and that's more than people displaced by conflict. Just maybe also for you to know, the figures for last year, 2024, will be published in mid-May. This is data by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, so you may want to stay tuned for that. But yeah, it's not out yet, so I can't share that with you yet. And then maybe looking at Europe, the latest data we have there for Europe and Central Asia, you see there is a lot of internal displacements by disasters due to the earthquakes in Turkey at the beginning of 2023, because in this data there's also data on disasters based on tectonic events like volcano eruptions and earthquakes. But what you can also see, and I'm sure since you're working on the news, there's a lot of also displacement within Europe and within countries due to floods, but also wildfires in Greece and other countries. In 2023, Canada and Greece accounted for 2/3 of all wildfire displacement within countries. So that's quite an issue there as well. Maybe some other data that I thought could be relevant for your work. This is based on an international data alliance on children on the move that is led by UNICEF, but also IOM, OECD are part of that. Since the European Union is working on a water resilience strategy, just to mention there that they estimated for 2023, 1 in 3 children worldwide was affected by water scarcity. And then also, if someone was born in 2020, they're 2 to 7 times more likely to be affected by extreme weather events like heat waves than someone who was born in 1960. So that also shows that there's a need to actually take action on this topic. But then also, as I mentioned, migration can be an adaptation strategy, and we see there's a lot of talk on the just transition, green transition here in Brussels. In 2022 to 23, the demand for workers increased twice as much on green jobs than the actual supply, and 1.8 million of these jobs are in the EU 27. So it's important to look at what contributions can migrants make. They may, have skills that could be used in renewable energy or other green sectors. They could be, helping to respond to this demand through reskilling or upskilling. And it's also important to keep in mind that migrants tend to be overrepresented in sectors that are affected by the climate crisis, such as agriculture and so on. And this picture is from Brazil, where Venezuelan migrants are being, are receiving capacity building from IOM on reskilling in the energy sector, such as on solar power, with a focus on women empowerment. And just maybe also to say a few words about what are some of the projections, the data we have. This is based on a World Bank report from 2021, where they looked at internal migration in different regions of the world. And they found that 216 million people may become internal migrants if no action is taken. And this can be reduced by 80% if action is taken. So this really highlights the importance of policy and responses and solutions. And just to mention how we approach that at IOM, we have an institutional strategy on climate mobility. So we focus on solutions for people to move. So that means migration as an adaptation strategy. We have supported 37 countries around the world in integrating migration into their national adaptation plans. And another example is early warning. So if there's a flood, if there's a storm coming, and migrants don't speak, the official language of the country, it's important to make sure that you reach the migrants in other languages. So if you imagine, if you receive a storm warning in Flemish or French, I don't know how many of you speak that, you may not understand, so it's important. And we have different tools available where we work with governments to be very inclusive in these responses. We also work with governments on solutions for people on the move, so those who are displaced or who are moving. And a nice example there is in the Philippines. We have a project where people who are displaced can access diaspora guaranteed loans for safe shelters. So that means that the Philippines is hit a lot by cyclones, often several times a year. There's a lot of internal displacement there all the time. So what they do is they can access these loans to kind of upscale and refurbish their house to make sure that it doesn't, fall down each time there's a cyclone that comes in. And so then we work with partners who go in and check actually that the plans they have make sense and are robust when it comes to a cyclone passing. There's also other approaches like nature-based solutions. So for instance, diaspora members in Morocco were investing in agroecology. We found it's important that they need to have access to land, but also to finance and information where they can invest. So there's different approaches on how to do that. And we're also establishing a climate mobility innovation lab with Italy for the Mediterranean, where we want to bring together different actors to talk about solutions. And the last point is on when we look at people, solutions for people to stay. There, another example is the Green Enterprise Development Fund in Iraq, where small and medium enterprise companies are supported, and they can look at things like green procurement, green distribution, water saving, etc. So making sure that there are other livelihood opportunities so people actually can stay, and that migration becomes a choice and not a necessity. And to close, just to say that we also collect a lot of data around the world. So the map I was showing you, some of the data also comes from IOM. And another example is the Afghanistan Climate Vulnerability Assessment that was just published a couple of months ago. And there what you can see is 73% of jobs in Afghanistan depend on climate-sensitive livelihoods. What is important is to look at early warning, and the EU is working a lot and supporting a lot of work there as well, but only 42% of Afghan villages have access to these measures. So just to give you an idea there. And with that, I'll close and put my contacts and that of my communications colleague, Ryan, if you want to get in touch later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's now your turn, Heather. I hope your microphone works.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, good. So good morning, everybody, and thank you so much to Susanne. What an amazing overview of both the issues and also some of the important data on this subject. I'm going to talk a bit more about policy responses and about the politics of climate migration. And then in Q&A, you can dive into whichever side you find more interesting of it. But I'm not going to repeat the facts and figures side. But what's really, I think, interesting on this as a journalistic issue is that typically in politics, the questions about climate migration are the wrong questions. Usually, typically, the first one is, how many people will move? Then the second question is, when will they move? And then the third question is, how can we build a big wall? And each of those questions is the wrong question, both because of the way that migration happens and the nature of the issue, and also because there are actually other much more relevant issues, particularly in terms of trying to devise a policy response. So I would say, so the reason why how many will move is the wrong question is because it depends massively on what kind of climate mitigation we managed to do. So Susanne mentioned the World Bank study of 2021, which said 217 will move if nothing happens. The World Bank has done another study, and there are others, which look at, okay, if Paris is reached, if the Paris Agreement is held to, when we reach we keep at 1.5 degrees, then only 20 million people might move. But actually, we're already beyond 1.5 degrees. And the other difficult thing then is the second question about when will they move? Because the distinction between fast onset events and slow onset events that Susanne referred to is breaking down. So you have fast onset events like, for example, a hurricane, but that is then exacerbated and the response to it is made more difficult by the slow onset events like sea level rise, or like water shortages. If you already have water shortages increasing in an area, and then you have an earthquake, completely non-climate related natural disaster, it's much more difficult to respond. So the number of people who are forced to move depends both on how bad things get in different parts of the world with regard to climate, but also on the way that the slow impact of climate affects other things that are already happening in their environment, either climate related or non-climate related. And that's why this is such a tricky issue, and why you will see very little advocacy about climate migration. See advocacy on lots of other issues in Brussels and in other capitals about what kind of asylum regimes we should have, what kinds of integration schemes should EU member states develop, and so on. Very little advocacy about climate migration because it's an inherently really, really tricky issue. Because one reason why is because climate is usually one among many reasons why people move. So Susanne put up that rather complex, flow chart about all the reasons why people move or stay. Climate then exacerbates some of those factors and may push more people to move, but climate alone did not cause them to move. And the reason why that matters is twofold. That matters because it matters hugely as to whether or not they can return. And I think that's perhaps the first question you would always want to ask as a journalist when you're asked to say something about climate migration is this an event from which people can return to their homes? For example, and because the second thing is because it relates to whether or not people can count as, for asylum, they can count as refugees, which of course is the big complex thing. Susanne talked primarily about migration, and a migrant is somebody who may or may not be a refugee in terms of definitions, but the definitions part is quite complex. So the first one about can they return, I think most of us would argue that Angelenos, people from Los Angeles who've lost their homes in the wildfire, shouldn't be considered as refugees in need of international protection because they come from a rich country, which so far right now is still providing federal assistance to them. Let's see how long that lasts. But also because we expect that they will return home. They're internally displaced probably within California right now, and they are likely to return to somewhere near where they can live. Whereas the question for many people who have to move because of climate is their land, where they come from, may be completely uninhabitable. May have become, so semi-subsistence agriculture, agricultural workers, for example, lose not only their home and their employment, but also their food source. So they can't go back there if there's desertification, constant drought, or indeed constant flood. That's too difficult. So the can they return question is fundamental to how the policy response, what it should look like, but also it tends to be rather important to the public. When people are seen as, fleeing from a natural disaster, but they're going to go back home, they tend to be treated with a lot more generosity than if they're expected not to be able to go back home. So that's really important for people, for example, who live on low-lying islands that will go beneath the sea. Where should they go? Already some of them, the governments are coming up with plans for permanent resettlement. They've got to do a deal with another country. So it's the can they return question is really fundamental. But it's also fundamental to think about the asylum question, because the Geneva Convention and indeed later definitions of an asylum seeker were created before climate change, well, before we recognize climate change. And they don't include climate and environmental problems as being a grounds for giving a person asylum. Now, then, again, it may be an exacerbating factor. For example, somebody who is fleeing from a disaster, a natural disaster, which is an environmentally created disaster, like a landslip or a flood or something like this. If, for example, they happen to be a minority, ethnic minority in that region, they may not be getting the same assistance as somebody who is of the majority. So discrimination on religious, racial, ethnic grounds, which is part of the Geneva Convention, might give them asylum. But the environmental problem that caused them to move, most proximately caused them to move, is not counted. So the IOM has it in its definition, environmental migrant, but that's a migrant. So just these legal issues around the terminology are really important because they make all the difference to the politics of it. But a refugee is still under the Geneva Convention, which includes no climate or environmental criterion. But, of course, we should also think about the way that the asylum regime globally is also affected by climate change. So there are people who move, people who need asylum for various reasons. But also, the majority of refugee camps in the world are in places that are extremely vulnerable to climate change. They're hot places where desert, water shortages are going to make it worse. In Bangladesh, for example, where people have been relocated, is extremely vulnerable to flood, to landslides, to cyclones. So both settlements, informal settlements by people who've had to move from one climate problem, and refugee camps where the UN or another body has built a refugee camp are pretty vulnerable to climate. So where will those people go? And who will receive them? Let's remember that a lot of the 2015, 2016 migrants from Syria who came to the European Union were fleeing from camps which had become uninhabitable and where there were food shortages. There was a problem with food deliveries. So people move for different reasons, but we should think about the nexus between refugee and climate status and those issues. We should think through the consequences of them. So. What does this mean in terms of policy responses? Well, the Let's Build a Wall is still pretty popular in some parts of the world, and it's possible we may find that simply the policy responses of some countries, which has been to try and keep people out with more barbed wire and coast guards not helping people but pushing people back and so on, will increase. Yes, it's true, this is indeed may well be part of the response, but it would be quite intelligent and pretty for a lot better in terms of foresight if we were to make investments in reducing the circumstances in which, the conditions under which people might be forced to move. So one is quite obviously climate mitigation. I won't even say more on that, but keeping things below, every 1/10 of a degree makes an enormous difference to the habitability of land. And of course we can expect major effects on the economy as we move above 1.5 degrees. There's also the question, there's investment in mitigation. There's also investment in climate adaptation. And Susanne had some interesting numbers on that. The fact that many people are living in areas which are vulnerable to climate change, but where adaptations can be made to maintain water supplies, to maintain energy supplies. This is also known as development aid, that thing that USAID used to do. And I think an interesting question is whether politically, will it become more acceptable? Will it make it easier for politicians to justify development aid if they said this is going to improve climate adaptation so that fewer people move, fewer people need to come to our country? That's a tricky argument for a lot of reasons, one of which is most people, as Susanne was saying, are internally displaced. Most of the pressure from people who are forced to move because of climate issues is actually felt within the country or within the region. It's not felt here in Europe. Plus, it also suggests that, you know, the primary objective of development aid is to keep people where they are. So these are not good arguments to make. But I think it's an interesting question of whether investment in climate adaptation and ensuring that more parts of the world can remain habitable, if we did that up front, that could really help in terms of ensuring that people are not forced to move. There's also this interesting question of investment in skills. Again, something Susanne mentioned earlier. The fact that the green transition is in fact quite a labour-intensive transition. You need people with skills to do insulation of buildings, retrofitting of all kinds of energy efficiency and resource efficiency measures, grid upgrades. There's an awful lot of work to be done, also to improve, to upgrade our infrastructure so it can cope with a much wider variation in temperature and in humidity. And that work will probably need to be done by migrant workers, given that in Europe we have major skills shortages and in fact labour shortages in this area. So it would also make sense to do an upfront investment in people where they live now. Wouldn't it, you know, for example, an interesting idea might be to expand Skills Academy in Morocco for clean tech. And for the green transition, that could be something that the EU could think about investing in. So there are different kind of far-sighted policy responses which you could think about as making sense. The question is whether politically that will be of interest. And the other big question about the politics is to bring in the way in which destruction of nature is exacerbating climate change in ways that will force people to move. So to give you one scenario of this, and if you think about the way water cycles work, the way you generate water that flows through rivers, humans can't generate water, by the way. Water has to come from the sky. It really does. And it comes through a hydrological cycle, which critically involves forests. If you don't have forests, you can't really create water because it's the forests that play that critical role of storing the water, condensing the water, putting it back up in the atmosphere and so on. And to give an example of that, the River Nile is basically fed by the Central African forests. Now, a huge number of people live along the Nile, not only in Egypt, but also all the way up through Ethiopia, right up to the source of the Nile. And if deforestation continues globally, and particularly, just give you the example of the Nile in, say, Central Africa, then you have a permanent long-term shortage of water through major conduits. So it would make sense to invest also in nature, particularly forests, to ensure that the water supply continues so that there isn't the desertification and so that people are not forced to move. So it's not just about climate action in terms of the direct, cutting of emissions. That's very important. It's also about investing in nature to continue to provide humans with the ecosystem services that we need in order to live, that we also need for industry, and so on. So those are the kinds of policy responses I'd like to see. I think that the one, I just leave you with one image that is the one that we don't want to see, but which may be quite attractive politically, and that's the idea of the armed lifeboat. There's an author who put forward this idea. The armed lifeboat is where those in the world who have the means to do so get in the lifeboat and build something in a part of the world that still has water, that still has a reasonable temperature, that isn't so subject to extreme weather events and so on, and then they arm themselves to keep everybody else out. Now, okay, that is another policy response, or it could be another human response by private sector actors. Think about the billionaires who like the idea of going to buying property in New Zealand, so on. But these are inherently extremely political issues, and I think we will have to make some tough choices in the years ahead. But you can't start with the question of, okay, we need to make tough choices, so how many people are going to move and when?
Thank you very much. This was already very enlightening for all of us, I guess. It's now your turn to ask questions. Wait until the microphone is there, and please state your name and the media you work for.